The ruins of New Sequoia stretched across the valley like broken teeth against the orange sky. Commander Jake Morrison stood in chains before the Galactic Tribunal and watched as 3 alien species decided the fate of humanity. The crystalline Vectari stood tallest among them, with bodies that looked like living glass that shifted colors with every thought. Beside them were the Jrel, who resembled giant mantises with their clicking mandibles and too many legs. The Moraine completed the Trinity of Judgment, with their amphibious forms and large unblinking eyes that seemed to see through to the soul. The Vectari. Judge spoke first, and its voice came through a translator that made every word sound cold and final. Humanity had been observed for 2 centuries since first contact, and the Coalition had reached a unanimous decision. Humans were too dangerous to exist alongside peaceful civilizations. They expanded too quickly and fought too readily and refused to bow to galactic law. The evidence was clear in the smoking colony behind them, where 300 humans had lived until yesterday. Dr. Claire Bennett stood among the other prisoners and felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders like stones. She was a xenobiologist who had spent 12 years studying alien ecosystems and building bridges between species. Now those bridges were burning, and she could do nothing but watch. Beside her stood Peter Hayes, who had engineered the water systems that kept New Sequoia alive, and Lauren White, whose medical clinic had served humans and aliens alike without discrimination. They were the last 37 survivors of a massacre that the Coalition called a warning. The sentence came without ceremony or mercy. Humanity had until dawn to prove their worth to the galaxy, or Earth itself would be destroyed from orbit. The fleet was already in position above the homeworld and waiting for the signal. The humans were given no tools and no weapons and no technology beyond the clothes they wore. Only the wilderness of the dying colony world remained, and the night stretched before them like an execution countdown. Claire felt something ancient stir in her chest as she listened to the judgment. Her grandmother had taught her stories about survival, and about people who faced extinction and refused to die quietly. The Cherokee had walked the Trail of Tears and survived boarding schools designed to erase them, and endured centuries of systematic destruction. They had done it by adapting and by holding on to what mattered and by proving again and again that they belonged on this Earth. Now Claire stood on an alien world facing the same choice her ancestors had faced. She stepped forward before Jake could stop her, and her voice cut through the murmuring of frightened colonists. The aliens turned their attention to her, and she felt the weight of their judgment like physical pressure against her skin. She spoke clearly and without begging, because her grandmother had taught her that dignity mattered even in defeat. If they must die at dawn, then let them spend the night proving what humans could do. Let them hunt and heal and weave. Let them show the galaxy that humanity's strength came not from weapons, but from the refusal to give up, even when giving up made sense. The Jrel commander clicked its mandibles in what might have been laughter. The Moraine physician tilted her head with curiosity. The Vectari scholar pulsed a pale yellow color that the translator interpreted as amusement. They conferred briefly in languages that hurt human ears to hear, and then agreed. The humans could have their night and the aliens would watch. It would make an interesting study in the final hours of a doomed species. Jake grabbed Claire's arm as the aliens returned to their observation post on the hillside. He wanted to know what she was thinking and whether she had just made things worse. Claire looked at the frightened faces around her and saw people who had already given up. They had watched their friends die and their homes burn, and now they waited for dawn like cattle waiting for slaughter. She could not let that be humanity's final statement to the universe. She gathered everyone close and spoke quickly because time was already slipping away. They had maybe 10 hours until sunrise, and in that time they needed to do 3 things. First, they needed food because half the colonists had not eaten since the attack. Second, they needed to treat the wounded because at least 8 people would die from their injuries before morning without help. Third, they needed to rebuild some sense of community because scattered, frightened individuals would accomplish nothing. Danny Cruz stepped forward first. He was former military and still carried himself like a soldier, even though his uniform was torn and bloody. He volunteered for the hunting party because sitting still would drive him crazy. Helen Foster joined him next with her botanist knowledge of the local ecosystem. Peter Hayes offered to build whatever tools they needed from the rubble. Lauren White was already moving toward the wounded with the focused intensity of a medic who refused to lose patience. Claire organized the others into teams with quick efficiency. Some would gather materials for shelter and fire. Others would scout for water and edible plants. A few would help Lauren with the wounded. Everyone had a task because everyone needed to feel useful, and because idle hands led to despair. Jake watched her work and realized she had done this before in some way. She moved like someone who understood that survival was not about individual strength, but about the strength of the group. As the sun touched the horizon, Claire led the hunting party into the forest beyond the ruined colony. The trees here were strange, with bark that felt like leather and leaves that whispered in frequencies just below human hearing. Danny moved quietly beside her while Helen cataloged plants with practiced eyes. The forest was full of life and full of danger, and they had no weapons beyond sharpened sticks and desperation. Claire knelt beside a muddy trail and studied the tracks pressed into the soft ground. 6 toes on each foot and a dragging tail and weight distribution that suggested something large and quadrupedal. She recognized them from her research as thornbacks, which were herbivores with natural armor and aggressive territorial behavior. Dangerous prey, but possible prey if they were smart and careful. She explained her plan to Danny and Helen, and they nodded because they had no better options. Behind them in the camp, Lauren was already at work with hands that moved with surgical precision despite having no surgical tools. Sophie Miller lay fevered and delirious from an infected wound, and without antibiotics she would be dead by midnight. Lauren refused to accept that outcome. The forest grew darker as Claire led her hunting party deeper into the wilderness away from the ruined colony. Danny Cruz moved behind her with the careful steps of someone trained for combat, but the alien terrain made even his practiced movements clumsy. Helen Foster brought up the rear and marked their trail with small tiers in the leather bark trees so they could find their way back. Above them, the Jrel observer followed through the canopy with movements too quick and precise for comfort. Claire stopped at a clearing where the thornback tracks converged with others. She knelt and pressed her fingers into the soft earth beside the prints and felt the moisture that told her these were fresh. The herd had passed through here within the last hour, and judging by the depth of the impressions, they were moving slowly, probably grazing on the phosphorescent fungi that grew in patches throughout the forest. She looked up at Danny and Helen and explained what they were hunting. Thornbacks were massive creatures that stood as tall as a human at the shoulder and stretched twice that length from nose to tail. Their backs were covered in bony plates that overlapped like armor, and their heads carried short horns that could gut a person with a single toss. They were herbivores, but that meant nothing when it came to temperament, because cornered herbivores were often more dangerous than predators. Claire had studied them from a distance during her research, but she had never tried to kill one. Now she had no choice. Danny asked the obvious question about how they were supposed to bring down something that big with nothing but sharpened sticks. Claire smiled and said that was where being human gave them an advantage. Humans were not strong or fast or equipped with natural weapons, but they could think and plan and work together. She had noticed something during her observations of thornbacks that might be their weakness. The creatures had excellent forward vision, but their peripheral sight was limited by the placement of their eyes. They also had a vulnerable spot behind their front shoulder where the armor plates did not quite connect. The plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. They would split up and use noise to drive a single thornback away from the herd toward a spot Claire had chosen. A fallen log created a natural barrier that would slow the creature down and limit its movement. Once it was isolated, Danny would distract it from the front, while Claire and Helen attacked from the sides, going for that vulnerable joint. If they could sever the muscles and tendons there, the creature would collapse and they could finish it quickly. Helen pointed out all the ways this could go wrong, and Claire agreed with every concern. They could miss the joint and just make the creature angry. The thornback could turn faster than expected and gore one of them. The herd could come to defend their member and trample all 3 humans into the mud. But they needed food, and this was their best option, and sometimes survival meant taking risks that would be stupid in any other context. They tracked the herd for another 20 minutes until they found them grazing in a grove of the leather bark trees. There were maybe 15 thornbacks, ranging from juveniles to a massive bull that probably weighed more than a ground vehicle. Claire pointed to a young adult on the edge of the herd that was slightly smaller than the others. That would be their target because it was big enough to feed everyone, but small enough that they might actually succeed. Danny circled wide to get in position while Helen gathered rocks for throwing. Claire waited until they were both ready and then gave the signal. Helen threw the first rock and hit a tree near the target thornback with a crack that echoed through the grove. The creature lifted its head and snorted. She threw another rock, and this one hit the thornback directly on its armored back. It bellowed and turned toward the source of the annoyance. Claire and Helen began making noise and moving through the underbrush to create the impression of multiple threats. The thornback charged toward them with surprising speed for something so large. The ground shook with each step, and Claire felt her heart hammering as she ran toward the fallen log. She could hear the creature behind her and smell its musk and feel the hot breath as it closed the distance. She dove behind the log just as the thornback reached it, and the creature had to slow down to navigate around the obstacle. Danny emerged from the other side, yelling and waving his sharpened stick. The thornback turned its attention to him and pawed the ground like a bull preparing to charge. Claire saw her moment and moved quickly. She came up alongside the creature and drove her sharpened stick toward the gap in its armor behind the front shoulder. The wood was not sharp enough and not strong enough, and she felt it skitter off bone instead of penetrating. The thornback whirled faster than something that large should be able to move. Its horn caught the edge of Claire's jacket and tore through the fabric. She stumbled backward and fell hard on her back with the wind knocked out of her lungs. The creature reared up, preparing to bring its full weight down on her. Danny threw his stick like a spear, and it caught the thornback in the eye. The creature screamed and reared higher. Helen was already moving with her own sharpened stick held like a lance. She sprinted at the exposed side of the rearing thornback and drove the point into the vulnerable joint with all her strength and body weight behind it. This time the stick penetrated deep. Hot blood sprayed across Helen's arms as the thornback's leg gave out. The creature crashed down on its side and thrashed. Claire rolled away from the flailing limbs and grabbed a rock from the ground. She brought it down on the thornback's skull again and again until the thrashing stopped. Danny joined her with another rock. Helen stood back covered in blood and shaking. The killing took another 5 minutes of brutal work that left all three of them exhausted and splattered with gore. They sat in silence for a moment beside their kill and listened to the herd moving away through the forest. The Zrel observer descended from the canopy and circled the dead thornback with its mandibles clicking rapidly. Claire could not tell if it was impressed or disgusted. She did not care. They had meat. Getting the carcass back to camp took another 3 hours of exhausting work. They could not carry it whole, so Danny used sharp rocks to butcher it into manageable pieces. Claire showed him where to cut based on her anatomical knowledge. Helen wrapped the meat in large leaves to keep it clean. They made 3 trips back and forth, hauling bloody chunks through the darkening forest. When they finally dragged the last piece into camp, the other colonists gathered around in amazement. Many had assumed the hunting party would fail or not return at all. Jake helped them pile the meat near the fire that Peter had built. Lauren looked up from her patient long enough to nod approval before returning to her work. Claire sat down heavily and felt every muscle in her body screaming. Her hands were cut and her clothes were ruined, and she smelled like death. But they had food now, and that was one impossible task completed. She looked toward the alien observation post on the hillside and saw the Zrel observer gesturing to its companions. The moraine had risen from her seated position. Even the Vekthari's colors had shifted to something that might indicate interest. Danny started a fire and began cooking strips of thornback meat on sharpened sticks. The smell made Claire's stomach growl despite her exhaustion. Around her, the colonists were beginning to hope again. Sophie Miller was still alive despite her infected wound. They had shelter and fire and food. Maybe they could actually survive until dawn, and maybe survival would be enough to change some alien minds. Lauren White had been working for 3 hours straight when the hunting party returned with their kill. She barely looked up from Sophie Miller's fevered body to acknowledge the success because her patient was dying, and nothing else mattered in that moment. The infection had spread from the deep gash in Sophie's leg up toward her hip in angry red lines that promised sepsis and death. Without antibiotics or proper surgical tools, Lauren was fighting a battle she knew she would probably lose. Sophie was 19 years old and had come to New Sequoia with dreams of studying alien botany. She had a laugh that could light up a room and a habit of collecting pressed flowers in a journal she carried everywhere. That journal was ash now, along with everything else the coalition had burned. Sophie herself would be ash by morning if Lauren could not find a way to stop the infection. Peter Hayes knelt beside Lauren and offered her a crude knife he had fashioned from a piece of scrap metal. The edge was rough, but he had done his best to sharpen it against stone. He also brought cloth torn from his own shirt that he had boiled in water to sterilize. It was not much, but it was more than Lauren had before. She took the knife and held it in the fire until the blade glowed red. Sophie stirred and moaned in her fever. Her skin was hot to the touch and slick with sweat. Lauren checked her pulse and found it racing far too fast. She gently peeled back the makeshift bandage covering the wound, and the smell that rose up made her stomach clench. The flesh around the gash was swollen and weeping pus. Dark streaks radiated outward, marking the path of the infection. Lauren had maybe 2 hours before the infection reached Sophie's bloodstream in force, and then nothing would save her. She made the decision quickly because hesitation would only make it harder. She turned to Peter and told him to hold Sophie down. She told Helen, who had just returned from the hunt, to find something for Sophie to bite down on. She told Danny to heat more water. Then she pressed the glowing knife blade against the worst of the infected tissue and began cutting away the dead flesh. Sophie screamed even through the leather strap between her teeth. The sound cut through the camp and made everyone stop what they were doing. Lauren kept working because stopping now would mean Sophie died anyway. She cut away blackened tissue and cleaned out pockets of infection and cauterized blood vessels that would not stop bleeding. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, even as her heart broke for the pain she was causing. When the cutting was done, Lauren had removed a section of flesh the size of her palm from Sophie's thigh. The wound was raw and ugly, but it was clean. She washed it with boiled water, and then turned her attention to the next problem. The infection was already in Sophie's system, and without antibiotics it would continue to spread. She needed something to fight it from the inside. Claire had left her field notes in a waterproof case that survived the attack. Lauren dug through them desperately, looking for any mention of plants with medicinal properties. The notes were detailed and scientific and filled with observations about the local ecosystem. On page 47, Lauren found what she was looking for. Claire had documented a succulent plant with blue sap that showed antibacterial properties in her lab tests. The plant grew in rocky areas near water sources. Lauren grabbed a lamp and went searching. She found the plants growing along the stream that fed into the colony's ruined reservoir. The succulent had thick, fleshy leaves that oozed blue sap when broken. Lauren collected an armful and brought them back to camp. She crushed the leaves between 2 rocks and extracted the sap into a clean container. The liquid was thick and smelled bitter, like medicine should. Peter helped her fashion a crude syringe from a hollow reed and a leather bladder. It was medieval, and probably violated every medical protocol Lauren had ever learned, but she was out of options. She injected the blue sap directly into the tissue around Sophie's wound, and then made Sophie drink a diluted version mixed with water. The girl's face twisted at the taste, but she swallowed it down. Now there was nothing to do but wait. Lauren sat beside Sophie and monitored her vital signs with her fingers pressed to the girl's wrist. The fever raged on. Sophie mumbled delirious words about flowers and home. Lauren wiped her forehead with a cool cloth and whispered reassurances she did not believe. The Moraine physician descended from the observation post an hour later. She moved with fluid grace across the camp until she stood beside Lauren and Sophie. Her large eyes studied the wounded girl and the crude medical setup. She asked in accented but clear human language how Lauren knew the plant would work. Her voice was soft and genuinely curious rather than mocking. Lauren looked up at the alien physician and felt exhaustion pulling at her bones. She explained that she did not know if it would work. She had a theory based on Claire's research and her own understanding of bacterial infections. She had tested it on herself first by rubbing a small amount of sap on a scratch and watching for allergic reaction. When none came, she had made a calculated risk. Sometimes medicine was not about certainty, but about making the best choice available with incomplete information. The Moraine tilted her head, and her throat sac pulsed with colors that Lauren could not interpret. The alien asked if humans always took such risks with their own kind. Lauren said yes, because the alternative was giving up, and humans were terrible at giving up. The Moraine made a sound that might have been approval or sadness. She did not offer to help, but she also did not leave. She simply watched as Lauren continued her vigil. Around midnight, Sophie's fever broke. The change was subtle at first, just a slight decrease in her skin temperature. Then her breathing evened out and the delirium faded. By 1 in the morning, she was sleeping peacefully instead of thrashing. Lauren checked the wound and found the angry red streaks had stopped spreading. The blue sap was working. She allowed herself to cry, then just for a moment. Peter put a hand on her shoulder and Helen brought her water to drink. Danny grinned and gave her a thumbs up from across the fire. Sophie Miller would live to see the dawn, and that felt like a miracle in a night full of impossible tasks. Lauren stood and stretched muscles that had locked up from hours of kneeling. She looked around the camp and saw other colonists who needed her attention, a broken arm that needed splinting, burns that needed treating, a concussion that needed monitoring. The work was never finished for a medic, and she was grateful for that. Busy hands and a busy mind left no room for fear. She worked through the night, moving from patient to patient with her crude tools and borrowed supplies. Peter helped her make splints from branches and cloth. Helen identified more medicinal plants from Claire's notes. Danny heated water and fetched whatever was needed. The camp became a makeshift hospital where humans proved they could heal even when the galaxy had decided they deserved death. The Moraine physician watched it all with her unblinking eyes. Once she stepped forward to show Lauren a better way to set a broken bone. The alien's hands were gentle and skilled. Lauren learned from her without question because knowledge had no nationality or species. When the bone was set correctly, the Moraine stepped back and returned to observing. By 3 in the morning, Lauren had treated everyone who needed immediate care. The camp was quiet except for the crackling fire and the soft sounds of sleeping colonists. She sat down next to Sophie, who was still sleeping peacefully. The girl's color had returned to normal and her breathing was steady. Lauren allowed herself to believe they might actually make it to dawn. She looked toward the hillside where the aliens maintained their observation post. The Moraine physician had not returned to her companions, but instead sat at the edge of the camp watching the humans with what might have been respect. Lauren raised a hand in acknowledgement. The alien's throat sac pulsed once in response. It was not friendship, but it was not hostility either. It was the first crack in the coalition's judgment, and Lauren intended to widen it before dawn came. The fire burned bright in the center of the camp and cast dancing shadows across the faces of the 37 survivors. Claire sat with her back against a fallen log and felt the warmth seep into her tired muscles. The hunt had taken everything from her physically, but now came the hardest task of all. She needed to weave these frightened, scattered people back into something that resembled a community. She needed to give them hope when hope seemed foolish and purpose when death waited at dawn. She began with stories because stories were how her people had always survived. Her grandmother had taught her that the Cherokee had endured because they remembered who they were, even when the world tried to make them forget. Claire spoke into the firelight and told them about the Trail of Tears when her ancestors had been forced from their homeland and marched west in winter. Thousands had died, but thousands had survived by helping each other and by refusing to give up their identity even as everything else was taken. The colonists listened because there was nothing else to do and because Claire's voice was steady in a night full of uncertainty. She told them about the boarding schools where Cherokee children were sent to have their culture beaten out of them. How they were punished for speaking their language and practicing their traditions. How some forgot everything they had been, but others held on to fragments and passed them down through generations. How Claire herself only knew a handful of words in Cherokee and a few songs, but she knew them fiercely because they connected her to something bigger than herself. Danny Cruz spoke up from across the fire. He said his family came from Mexico 3 generations back, and they had their own stories of survival. His great-grandmother had crossed the border with nothing and built a life through hard work and determination. She had taught her children to remember where they came from, while reaching for where they wanted to go. Danny said that was what being human meant to him. Carrying the past while building the future. Helen Foster added her voice next. She talked about being a botanist and how plants had taught her about adaptation. Every species that survived did so by finding a way to thrive in whatever environment they landed in. Some plants grew tall to reach the light. Others grew deep roots to find water. Some produced toxins to defend themselves while others produced flowers to attract helpers. There was no single right way to survive. The key was flexibility and willingness to change while staying true to your essential nature. Peter Hayes stood and moved to the pile of materials he had gathered from the ruins. He began sorting through twisted metal and broken ceramics and scorched wood. He said that engineers understood that nothing was ever truly destroyed. Materials changed form, but they could always be repurposed. This camp was built from the wreckage of their homes. Their tools were fashioned from debris. Even their hope was rebuilt from the ashes of despair. He held up a piece of metal that had been part of someone's kitchen and was now a knife blade. Transformation was the ultimate human skill. Jake Morrison watched his people come alive around the fire and felt something shift in his chest. He had been focused on survival in the military sense. Tactics and defenses and counting hours until the inevitable end. But Claire was doing something different. She was reminding them why survival mattered in the first place. They were not just bodies trying to stay alive until dawn. They were humans with histories and connections and purposes that went beyond individual existence. Claire stood and walked to the edge of the firelight. She gathered reeds that grew along the stream and brought them back to the fire. Her hands moved with practiced motions as she began weaving them together. The pattern was simple but strong. Over and under and pull tight. The rhythm was meditative, and others watched as the basket took shape in her hands. She explained that her grandmother had taught her this when she was young. How each reed was weak alone, but together they could hold weight and carry burdens. She passed the basket to Sophie Miller, who had woken from her fever, and sat wrapped in blankets near the fire. Sophie held the basket carefully like the precious thing it was. Claire handed her reeds and showed her the pattern. Sophie's hands were shaky, but she managed the weaving. The basket passed around the circle, and each person added a row. Some did it wrong and had to redo it. Others picked it up quickly. It did not matter because the point was not perfection, but participation. By the time the basket returned to Claire, it was large enough to hold water or food or supplies. It was also a physical representation of what they had built tonight. Individual strands woven together into something useful and strong. Claire filled it with water from the stream and brought it back to share. Each person drank and passed it on. It was communion and community and everything. Humans did best when they stopped fighting each other and started working together. The Vekthari scholar descended from the observation post and approached the fire with movements that seemed uncertain. Its crystalline body reflected the flames in strange patterns of light. It asked permission to observe more closely, and Jake granted it because they had nothing to hide. The alien moved among the colonists and studied their work with what seemed like genuine curiosity. It watched Peter fashion tools and Helen prepare medicinal plants and Lauren check on her patients. The Vekthari stopped in front of Claire and asked a question through its translator. It wanted to know why humans spent time on activities that did not directly contribute to survival. The basket was functional, but the stories and songs served no practical purpose. They would not help the colonists fight or hunt or build shelter. Why waste precious energy on such things? Claire looked up at the alien and saw an opportunity. She explained that humans needed more than just food and shelter to survive. They needed meaning and connection and something to believe in. The stories reminded them who they were. The songs gave them comfort. The weaving taught them to work together. Without these things, humans might survive physically, but they would lose what made them human. And being human was worth fighting for even in the face of extinction. The Vekthari's colors shifted through patterns that might have indicated thought or confusion or calculation. It stood silent for a long moment and then returned to the observation post without another word. Claire did not know if her answer had changed anything, but she had spoken her truth. That was all she could do. As the night deepened, the camp settled into a rhythm of activity and rest. Some people kept working on practical tasks like gathering firewood or preparing food. Others simply sat together and talked quietly. A few sang old songs from Earth that echoed across the alien landscape. Children who had been silent with fear began to play games near the fire. Life was reasserting itself against the judgment of death. Jake approached Claire as she worked on fashioning rope from plant fibers. He sat down beside her and picked up the task without asking. His hands were clumsy at first, but he learned quickly. They worked in comfortable silence for a while before he spoke. He told her that he had been wrong to doubt her plan. He had thought they needed weapons and defenses and military strategy. But what they actually needed was exactly what she was providing: purpose and community and reasons to keep fighting. Claire smiled and said she had learned from her grandmother, who had learned from hers. The Cherokee had survived not because they were the strongest or the smartest, but because they refused to let go of what made them a people. Even when they lost their land and their language and their children, they held on to the core of their identity. That stubborn refusal to disappear was the most human trait of all. It was what would save them if anything could. Helen joined them and began working on her own section of rope. Then Danny came, and then Peter, and then Sophie, despite her injury. They sat in a circle, weaving plant fibers into something stronger than the individual strands. Above them, the stars were alien, but the fire was universal. The work was ancient, but the purpose was timeless. They were humans doing what humans had always done, surviving together because surviving alone was too hard and too lonely and too much like giving up. The Cherokee commander watched the human camp with growing agitation that made its mandibles click rapidly in the cold night air. It paced along the observation post with movements that spoke of barely contained violence. The other two judges sat in their designated positions, but the Cherokee could not remain still. Everything it was seeing confirmed its worst fears about this species and strengthened its conviction that humanity needed to be eliminated. Immediately, the commander turned to its companions and spoke in the harsh, clicking language of its people. The translator rendered its words into something the Moraine and Victhari could understand. Humans were too adaptable and too resourceful and too unpredictable. They had been given nothing, and in just a few hours they had created tools and weapons and shelter. They had hunted successfully in an alien environment. They had treated serious injuries without proper medical equipment. Most dangerously, they had rebuilt their social cohesion after a devastating attack. This was not a species that would accept subjugation or containment. This was a species that would always find a way to survive and spread, and eventually threaten everyone around them. The Moraine physician responded in her own melodious language. She had watched Lauren work through the night and seen genuine compassion in the human medic's actions. Lauren had risked using untested plant compounds on herself before administering them to her patient. She had worked until exhaustion to save a single young life. These were not the actions of a mindlessly aggressive species. The Moraine admitted that humans were dangerous, but danger and evil were not the same thing. Perhaps humans simply needed guidance rather than genocide. The Victhari scholar pulsed with colors that indicated deep contemplation. Its crystalline form caught the starlight and scattered it in mathematical patterns. It spoke in precise logical terms about the data they had collected. Humans showed remarkable cognitive flexibility and social organization. Their capacity for rapid learning and environmental adaptation exceeded anything in the galactic databases. They created art and music and stories even in survival situations, which suggested a complex internal life that went beyond mere animal instinct. The question was whether this complexity made them more dangerous or more valuable. The debate intensified as midnight approached. The Cherokee commander insisted that adaptability was exactly what made humans too dangerous. A species that could learn and change so quickly would eventually outpace and outcompete every other civilization. They had seen it happen before with other aggressive species that had to be contained or eliminated. Humans were following the same pattern but moving even faster. The coalition had a responsibility to protect the peaceful species of the galaxy, even if that meant making hard choices. The Moraine disagreed with passion that made her throat sac swell and pulse with emotion. She pointed to her own species' history when they had been warlike and territorial. The Moraine had nearly destroyed themselves in conflicts that spanned generations. They had survived only by choosing a different path, and by receiving help from more advanced species who saw potential in them. She believed humans deserved the same chance. Yes, they were violent, but they were also capable of incredible compassion. The two traits existed together, and perhaps the compassion could be nurtured while the violence was channeled into productive directions. The Victhari scholar processed both arguments with its logical mind. It noted that the Cherokee position was based on fear of future threat, while the Moraine position was based on hope for future change. Both were making predictions about human behavior that could not be proven until given time to develop. The scholar proposed a middle ground. Instead of immediate execution or full freedom, they could implement a containment and observation protocol. Restrict human expansion to their current systems and monitor their development for several generations. Use that time to gather more data and make a more informed decision. The Cherokee commander rejected this compromise with an angry clatter of mandibles. Containment had failed with other species before. Aggressive civilizations always found ways to break their restrictions, and by the time the coalition recognized the threat, it was too late. The commander had seen what happened when difficult decisions were delayed out of misguided mercy. Entire planets had burned because someone decided to give a dangerous species one more chance. The commander would not allow that to happen again. Down in the camp, Claire stood and began walking toward the observation post. Jake called after her, but she kept moving with determined steps. She had been listening to the alien debate through translation devices that leaked audio, and she understood that time was running out. The Cherokee commander was winning the argument through force of certainty, while the other judges wavered in their uncertainty. She needed to shift the balance before the coalition decided to end the experiment early. She stopped at the base of the hillside and called up to the aliens in a clear voice. She asked for permission to address them directly. The Drell commander wanted to refuse, but the Moraine physician was curious about what the human would say. She granted Claire 3 minutes to speak. The Vectari scholar agreed to listen because more data was always valuable. Claire climbed the hillside slowly to give herself time to organize her thoughts. She needed to say something that would fracture their certainty and plant doubt in their judgment. The 3 alien judges turned their attention to this single, human woman who stood before them, covered in dirt and blood but unbuoyed by exhaustion or fear. Claire took a breath and began speaking. She did not defend humanity's wars or pretend her people were peaceful. She did not make excuses for human aggression or territorial expansion. Instead, she told them the truth about what it meant to be human. She explained that every human carried both the capacity for terrible destruction and profound creation. They woke up every morning faced with the choice of which capacity to nurture. Some days they chose poorly and people died and civilizations burned, but other days they chose well, and sick people were healed and hungry people were fed and lonely people found community. The key was that it was always a choice. Humans were not mindless animals driven by instinct. They were thinking beings capable of learning and changing and choosing different paths. Claire talked about her grandmother, who had survived boarding schools designed to erase Cherokee culture. Those schools were created by humans who chose destruction, but her grandmother's survival was enabled by other humans who chose to help, even when helping was dangerous. Both impulses existed in the same species and sometimes in the same individuals. The difference was not in the tools or the capacity, but in the daily choice of how to use them. She pointed back to the camp where her people had spent the night hunting and healing and weaving. Every skill they demonstrated could be used for harm or help. Sharp sticks could hunt prey or kill people. Medicine could save lives or create biological weapons. Community bonds could build civilizations or fuel genocides. The tools were neutral. The choice was everything. The Vectari scholar's crystalline body flashed bright blue in a color the translator identified as revelation or sudden understanding. The Moraine physician's throat sac swelled with emotion that might have been tears. Even the Drell commander went very still with its mandibles frozen mid-click. Claire had said something that penetrated their certainty and forced them to reconsider assumptions they had held as absolute truth. She continued speaking and told them that the galaxy they had built was stagnant. 3 species had reached a comfortable equilibrium and stopped growing. They were safe, but they were also unchanging. Humanity brought chaos, but they also brought innovation. They brought war, but they also brought the desperate creativity that came from always being on the edge of extinction. The galaxy needed that chaos to avoid stagnation, even if chaos was uncomfortable and dangerous. Claire's 3 minutes ended, but no one stopped her from speaking. She finished by saying that humanity was dangerous, but they were also necessary. If the coalition chose to destroy Earth, they would be choosing safety over growth and stagnation over evolution. They would be choosing the comfortable death of a civilization that had stopped challenging itself. She could not force them to spare her people, but she could ask them to consider what they would lose by eliminating the chaos that humans represented. She turned and walked back down the hillside without waiting for a response. Her legs shook with exhaustion and adrenaline, but she kept her spine straight until she was out of sight. Behind her, the 3 alien judges sat in silence. The certainty they had carried into this night was cracking. The Moraine physician looked at the Drell commander and asked if they were really prepared to commit genocide against a species capable of such profound self-awareness. The Vectari scholar was already recalculating its models of human behavior based on this new data. Even the Drell commander seemed less certain than before, though it would not admit doubt aloud. Claire reached the bottom of the hillside and let herself collapse against a boulder where her people could not see her weakness. Her hands were shaking and her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. She had just gambled everything on words and had no idea if those words would matter. The aliens were debating her speech now, and she could hear the rise and fall of their strange languages mixing in the night air. She closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. Jake found her there a few minutes later. He sat down beside her without speaking and offered her water from the woven basket. She drank gratefully and handed it back. He told her that was either the bravest thing he had ever seen or the most foolish, and he had not decided which. Claire laughed without humor and said it was probably both. Bravery and foolishness looked the same from the outside. The only difference was whether you survived to tell the story afterward. Up on the hillside, the debate among the alien judges had moved from theoretical to personal. The Moraine physician spoke about her own people's violent history with a rawness that suggested old wounds. The Moraine had evolved on a world with scarce resources and fierce competition. They had developed weapons and armies and concepts of total warfare before they achieved spaceflight. For 3,000 years they had fought among themselves in conflicts that depopulated entire continents. The oceans had run red with their blood, but then something changed. A plague swept through the Moraine homeworld that killed indiscriminately across all factions. In the face of extinction, the warriors had put down their weapons and the scientists had worked together to find a cure. It took 50 years of cooperation to develop treatments that saved their species. In that time, the Moraine learned that survival required more than military strength. It required the ability to choose cooperation over conflict, even when conflict felt natural. The physician looked at the Cherokee commander and asked a pointed question. If the galaxy had judged the ancient Moraine by their worst impulses and destroyed them preemptively, how much would have been lost? The Moraine had gone on to make profound contributions to galactic medicine and philosophy. They had helped dozens of species through plagues and disasters. Their music was considered the most mathematically beautiful in known space. All of that would have been erased if some ancient coalition had decided the Moraine were too dangerous to exist. The Cherokee commander responded with the clicking harshness of its language. The Moraine had changed because they nearly destroyed themselves first. They had learned from consequence and suffering. But humanity had not yet faced that crucible. They were still in their aggressive expansionist phase and showed no signs of slowing. The commander argued that waiting for humans to nearly destroy themselves before intervening was irresponsible. How many other species would suffer while the galaxy waited for humans to learn basic civilization? The Vectari scholar interjected with its logical precision. It noted that the Cherokee argument assumed human development would follow the same pattern as other species. But humans were already demonstrating unusual characteristics. They showed capacity for empathy and self-reflection, even while engaged in violent behavior. They created art during wartime. They had ethical frameworks that condemned their own worst actions even when they continued to commit those actions. This suggested an internal conflict that most aggressive species did not experience until much later in their development. The scholar proposed that humanity might be in a unique transitional state. They were aware enough to recognize their flaws, but not yet disciplined enough to consistently overcome them. This was actually the most dangerous time to judge them, because they were in flux. Wait 50 years and they might be significantly different. Destroy them now and the galaxy would never know what they might have become. Down in the camp, Sophie Miller began to sing. Her voice was weak from fever but pure in the cold night air. She sang a Cherokee hymn that Claire's grandmother had taught her years ago during a visit to the research station. Sophie did not know what the words meant, but she had memorized the sounds because the melody was beautiful. Other colonists who knew the hymn joined their voices to hers. The harmony rose up from the camp and carried across the hillside. The 3 alien judges fell silent as the music reached them. The Cherokee commander had never heard anything like it. The sound was neither communication nor warning call. It served no practical purpose that its tactical mind could identify. Yet something about the layered harmonies resonated in its thorax in a way that was deeply uncomfortable because it suggested dimensions to human consciousness that the commander had not accounted for. The Moraine physician felt something she had not experienced in decades. Tears formed in her large eyes and slipped down her face. The music touched something primal in her biology that connected to loss and hope, and the desperate defiance of singing when death approached. Her own people had sung in the plague years when they had nothing else left. She understood what the humans were doing because she had done it herself when her world was ending. The Vectari scholar recorded every frequency and harmonic interval with its sophisticated sensory apparatus. It analyzed the mathematical relationships between the voices and found patterns that were both complex and strangely beautiful. But the analysis could not explain why the music caused its crystalline structure to resonate in sympathetic vibrations. There was something about the sound that transcended pure mathematics and entered territory the scholar had no frameworks to understand. The hymn ended, and silence settled over the landscape again. The Cherokee commander broke that silence with a question directed at the Moraine physician. It asked what the singing meant, and why humans would waste energy on sound production that served no survival function. The physician responded that the commander was asking the wrong question. The singing was survival function. It reminded the humans of their shared identity and gave them emotional strength to continue fighting. Without it, they might give up and die before dawn, even if they had all the physical resources they needed. Claire stood and walked back toward the observation post. This time, she did not climb the hillside but stood at the base and spoke loud enough for the aliens to hear. She said the singing was called a hymn and it was a prayer set to music. Her people had sung it during the worst times of their history. On the Trail of Tears when they were marched from their homes. In the boarding schools when they were punished for being who they were. During wars and plagues and famines, the hymn had survived because it meant something deeper than the individual words. It meant we are still here and we refuse to disappear quietly. She told the aliens that if they destroyed humanity, they would not just be eliminating a dangerous species, they would be erasing 10,000 years of accumulated culture and knowledge and music. Every human language and story and song would vanish. Every piece of art and every philosophical framework and every scientific insight would be lost. The galaxy would be safer perhaps, but it would also be poorer. Was that really the trade they wanted to make? The Vekthari scholar descended from the hillside and approached Claire with slow, deliberate movements. Its crystalline body reflected the firelight from the camp in prismatic patterns. It asked Claire a direct question. If humanity was given another chance, how could they prove they would choose creation over destruction? What guarantee could they offer that they would not become the aggressive threat the coalition feared? Claire met the alien's gaze without flinching. She said there were no guarantees because free will meant the possibility of choosing wrong. She could not promise that every human would always choose well. She could not even promise that she herself would always choose well. What she could promise was that humans would keep trying. They would build ethical frameworks and enforce them imperfectly. They would make mistakes and learn from some of them. They would hurt each other and heal each other and slowly figure out how to do more of the latter and less of the former. That was all any species could offer. The choice to keep trying to be better even when being better was hard. The Vekthari scholar processed this answer through its logical matrices. After a long pause, it spoke a single word through the translator. Sufficient. Then it returned to the hillside to rejoin its fellow judges. Claire did not know what sufficient meant in this context, but she allowed herself to hope it meant something positive. The night was winding down toward dawn now. The eastern horizon showed the first hints of light that would either bring salvation or death. Jake gathered the colonists together for whatever was coming next. They stood in a loose group around the fire and waited. Some held hands. Others simply stood close enough to draw comfort from proximity. They were 37 humans who had hunted and healed and woven themselves back into something worth saving. Whether the aliens agreed remained to be seen. The first rays of dawn broke across the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that were beautiful despite the fear they carried. Jake Morrison stood at the front of his people and watched the light creep across the valley toward their camp. Behind him, 37 colonists waited in silence for a judgment that would determine not just their fate, but the fate of their entire species. Earth hung in space above them, vulnerable, and unaware that its existence depended on what happened in the next few minutes. The three alien judges rose from their observation post and moved together toward a position halfway between their hillside and the human camp. They conferred in their various languages with gestures and color changes and mandible clicks that the humans could not interpret. The debate seemed heated at times, with the Jrel commander making sharp, aggressive movements, while the Moraine physician responded with the swelling of her throat sac that indicated strong emotion. The Vekthari scholar pulsed through a rainbow of colors that might have represented calculation or confusion, or something entirely alien. Claire stood beside Jake and felt her heart hammering against her ribs. She had done everything she could think of to prove humanity's worth. They had hunted successfully in an alien environment. They had healed their wounded without proper medical tools. They had rebuilt their community from the ashes of destruction. They had shown adaptability and compassion and the capacity for self-reflection. If that was not enough, then nothing would be, and she would die knowing she had given everything she had. The Jrel commander spoke first when the judges reached their decision point. Its mandibles clicked rapidly as it addressed its companions in a voice loud enough for the humans to hear through their translators. The commander maintained its position that humanity was too dangerous to allow continued existence. The events of the night had only reinforced this conclusion. Humans learned too quickly and adapted too easily and showed too much resourcefulness. They were apex predators wearing the disguise of civilization. The galaxy would be safer without them. The Moraine physician responded with visible distress that made her whole body tremble. She spoke of what she had witnessed Lauren do through the night. The human medic had worked until exhaustion to save lives, including using untested medicine on herself first to protect her patient. That was not the behavior of a mindless predator. That was the behavior of a sentient being capable of profound compassion. The Moraine argued that destroying such a species would be a crime worse than any crime humans had committed. The Vekthari scholar remained silent through this exchange. Its crystalline form had gone completely still, and its colors had faded to a pale neutral shade that gave no indication of its thoughts. The other two judges turned to it, waiting for the deciding vote. The scholar had positioned itself as the logical neutral party, and now it held humanity's fate in its decision. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. The sun continued its climb and the light grew stronger. Sophie Miller began humming the Cherokee hymn again so quietly that only those closest to her could hear. Others picked it up until a soft wave of melody rose from the group of colonists. It was defiance and prayer and goodbye all mixed together in harmonies that had survived centuries of human hardship. The Vekthari scholar finally moved, and its colors shifted to bright blue. It spoke in its precise mathematical language, and the translator rendered its verdict. The scholar had analyzed all available data and reached a conclusion. Humanity represented a statistical anomaly that warranted further study rather than immediate elimination. The species showed characteristics that did not fit existing models of civilization development. They possessed advanced empathy alongside aggressive tendencies. They created art during crisis situations. They demonstrated metacognition about their own flaws while simultaneously being unable to consistently overcome those flaws. The scholar proposed an alternative to genocide. Humanity would be granted provisional status within the galactic community under a treaty that the scholar designated as the Covenant of New Sequoia. Earth and its colonies would be allowed to continue existing but under strict monitoring. Human expansion would be restricted to their current systems for 3 generations. Alien observers would be stationed on Earth and major colonies. Humans would be required to participate in cultural exchange programs and submit to galactic law in all matters involving other species. Most importantly, humans would be required to teach. The scholar had identified specific skills that humanity possessed, which could benefit the wider galaxy. Their medical adaptability and problem-solving under pressure, their capacity for rapid environmental analysis, their methods of maintaining social cohesion through non-hierarchical means. These skills needed to be studied and understood and potentially taught to other species who had become too comfortable in their established patterns. The Cherokee commander objected immediately. Restricted expansion would only delay the inevitable conflict. Humans would chafe under any restrictions and eventually break free with greater numbers and more advanced technology. Better to end the threat now than allow it to grow stronger, while pretending to observe rules. The commander demanded a final vote rather than continued debate. The Moraine physician spoke her agreement with the Vekthari proposal. She believed humanity deserved the chance to prove themselves over time, rather than being judged on their current imperfect state. She also saw value in what humans could teach the rest of the galaxy. The Moraine had grown comfortable in their pacifism, but perhaps too comfortable. They had forgotten what it meant to struggle and adapt. Learning from humanity might prevent their own civilization from stagnating into irrelevance. The vote was called. The Cherokee commander voted for destruction. The Moraine physician voted for the Covenant. The Vekthari scholar held the deciding vote, and it cast that vote for provisional acceptance. 2-1. Humanity would live. Jake Morrison felt his knees go weak with relief. Around him, colonists were crying and hugging and laughing with the desperate joy of people who had been given life back after accepting death. Claire stood very still and felt tears running down her face. Sophie Miller's humming transformed into full-voiced singing, and others joined until the hymn rang out across the valley in defiant celebration. The 3 alien judges approached, the human camp with formal measured steps. The Cherokee commander's body language radiated disapproval, but it was bound by the majority decision. The Moraine physician's throat sac pulsed with colors that translated as joy and hope. The Vekthari scholar remained neutral in appearance, but its voice carried something that might have been satisfaction when it addressed the humans. The scholar explained the terms of the covenant in detail. Humanity would accept permanent observers from all 3 species on Earth and major colonies. A council station would be established to monitor human activities and ensure compliance with galactic law. Human ships would be restricted from traveling beyond designated boundaries without permission. Any violations would result in immediate sanctions up to and including the original sentence of species elimination. In exchange, humanity would be granted access to galactic trade networks and cultural exchanges. They would send teachers to other worlds to share their knowledge. They would receive teachers from other species to learn alien sciences and philosophies. The goal was integration rather than isolation, to bring humanity into the galactic community as contributing members rather than threats to be contained. Claire stepped forward and asked a question that had been burning in her mind. She wanted to know what would happen after 3 generations when the monitoring period ended. Would humanity be judged again? Or would they finally be accepted as equals? The Vekthari scholar responded that the covenant had provisions for graduated independence based on demonstrated peaceful behavior. If humanity showed consistent growth toward less aggressive patterns, they could earn full autonomous status. Within the galactic community, Jake formally accepted the terms on behalf of humanity, with the understanding that Earth's government would need to ratify the treaty, but that he had no doubt they would accept any alternative to extinction. The Zrel commander made a harsh clicking sound that might have been discussed but did not object. The Moraine physician expressed her hope that this would be the beginning of a beautiful friendship between species. The Vekthari scholar simply recorded the agreement and transmitted it to the coalition fleet above Earth. The transmission took 30 seconds to reach the fleet and another 30 for the response to return. In that minute, the colonists held their breath and waited to see if the ships above Earth would stand down or open fire regardless of the covenant. When the response came through, it was terse but definitive. The fleet would withdraw to observation distance. The sentence of extinction was stayed pending ratification of the treaty. Earth was safe. The colonists erupted in celebration that was part relief and part exhaustion and part disbelief. They had survived the impossible night and won a future for their species through nothing but determination and the willingness to show what humanity could be at its best. Peter Hayes started a fire and began cooking the remaining thornback meat for a breakfast that felt like a feast. 10 years passed like water flowing downhill with moments of turbulence and stretches of calm. Claire Bennett stood in the Galactic Council chamber on the orbital station that humanity had helped build above Earth and felt the weight of history pressing on her shoulders. She was older now, with silver threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes from a decade of smiling and worrying in equal measure. She wore traditional Cherokee patterns woven into her formal council robes because she had learned that honoring her heritage made her stronger in these alien spaces. The council chamber was a massive sphere with representatives from 47 species, seated in concentric rings that surrounded a central speaking platform. The architecture was designed to emphasize equality, with no species sitting higher than another. Light filtered in through crystalline panels that adjusted automatically to accommodate the visual needs of different species. The air was carefully balanced to support multiple biochemistries, though everyone wore personal atmosphere generators just in case. Today was the day Earth's provisional status would be reviewed for the first time. 3 generations was still far away, but the Covenant had provisions for early evaluation if humanity showed sufficient progress. Claire had spent the last 10 years working toward this moment, and she felt the familiar mixture of hope and fear that accompanied every major milestone. Humanity had done well in many ways, but they had also stumbled and fallen and made mistakes that confirmed the Trail's worst predictions. The Vekthari scholar who had cast the deciding vote 10 years ago now served as the Council's chief administrator. Its crystalline body had grown more complex over the decade with new facets and internal structures that reflected its accumulated wisdom. It called the session to order with a harmonic tone that resonated through the chamber. Claire took her position on the speaking platform and prepared to give an accounting of humanity's decade under the Covenant. She began with the successes because there were many worth celebrating. New Sequoia had been rebuilt as an interspecies learning center, where humans and aliens studied together. The medical exchange program that Lauren White had pioneered had led to breakthroughs in treating diseases that affected multiple species. A human plant biologist working with marine aquatic specialists had developed new food sources that could grow in environments previously thought uninhabitable. Human engineers had collaborated with Vectari architects to design ships that were both functional and beautiful in ways neither species could have achieved alone. The cultural exchanges had exceeded everyone's expectations. Human music had spread across the galaxy like wildfire, with alien species adapting human instruments and harmonies to their own traditions. A Cherokee composer had created a symphony that blended human jazz with the clicking rhythms of its people, and the piece had won the Galactic Arts Prize. Moraine poets were writing in human languages, and human poets were attempting the complex color-based language of the Vectari. The boundaries between species were becoming permeable in ways that enriched everyone. Claire also reported on the monitoring data that showed humanity's violent conflicts had decreased by 32% over the decade. War had not disappeared from Earth, but it had become less common and less total. International cooperation had increased as humans realized they needed to present a united front to the galaxy. Old grudges were being set aside in favor of species-level survival. The change was slow and imperfect, but it was real and measurable. But Claire did not hide the failures because the Covenant required honest reporting. 3 years ago, a human mining operation had violated territorial boundaries and encroached on a protected Vectari crystal field. The incident had been resolved peacefully, but it demonstrated that some humans still struggled with respecting alien property rights. 5 years ago, a human colony ship had attempted to exceed its designated boundaries and had been turned back by coalition forces. The crew had argued they were exploring, not expanding, but the distinction mattered little when the Covenant was clear about restrictions. Most seriously, 2 years ago, a group of human extremists had attacked an alien diplomatic mission on Earth, killing 2 Moraine observers. The perpetrators had been caught and prosecuted under human law, but the damage to interspecies relations had been severe. The Cherokee commander had used the incident to argue that humanity was inherently violent and incapable of peaceful coexistence. It had taken months of careful diplomacy to prevent the Covenant from being revoked entirely. Claire finished her report and opened the floor for questions. The Cherokee representative stood first, with mandibles clicking in what Claire had learned to recognize as barely contained hostility. The Cherokee asked how humanity could be trusted when extremist elements still committed violence against peaceful aliens. What guarantee was there that such attacks would not escalate as human population continued to grow? Claire responded honestly because dishonesty would destroy any trust they had built. She said there was no guarantee because humans remained imperfect beings capable of terrible choices. But the important data was not that some humans committed violence, but how humanity as a whole responded to that violence. The attackers had been arrested by human law enforcement within hours. They had been tried in public courts and sentenced to life imprisonment. Human leaders across all nations had condemned the attack, and thousands of humans had gathered to mourn the Moraine victims. The majority had chosen compassion over violence, even though the violent minority got more attention. A Moraine representative spoke next, with her throat sac pulsing gentle colors. She had worked closely with Lauren White at the medical center on New Sequoia and wanted to share her perspective. She said that in 10 years of collaboration, she had never once felt threatened by her human colleagues. They argued sometimes about methodology and got frustrated with each other's different approaches. But those were the conflicts of people who cared deeply about their work. She had delivered 3 children during her time on New Sequoia, and human medics had attended each birth with the same dedication they showed to their own people. The Vectari administrator asked Claire about human plans for the future. If the Covenant restrictions were lifted, what would humanity do with their freedom? Would they resume rapid expansion and aggressive resource acquisition? Claire said she could not speak for every human government or every individual, but she could share the consensus that had emerged from recent global councils. Humanity wanted to continue integration rather than isolation. They wanted to earn their place as full members of the galactic community, not through conquest but through contribution. The restrictions had taught them patience and cooperation, and they did not want to lose those lessons. A representative from a species Claire did not recognize asked about human culture and whether integration was causing humanity to lose its unique identity. This was a question Claire had wrestled with personally, She responded that culture was not static but living and changing. Cherokee culture had survived centuries of attempted erasure by adapting and incorporating new elements while keeping core values intact. Human culture as a whole was doing the same thing. They were learning from aliens and teaching aliens and creating something new that honored the past while embracing the future. Some traditions would be lost, and that was painful, but new traditions were being born, and that was beautiful. The discussion continued for hours, with representatives asking questions and sharing observations. The tone was mostly positive, with even the Cherokee grudgingly acknowledging improvements in human behavior. The Vekthari administrator called for a preliminary vote on whether to advance humanity's status from provisional to probationary, which would allow slightly more freedom of movement while maintaining monitoring. The vote passed with 78% approval. It was not full acceptance, but it was progress. After the session ended, Claire found herself surrounded by alien representatives who wanted to talk more informally. A young Vekthari scholar asked her to explain the concept of hope, because its species approached future events through probability calculations rather than emotional expectation. Claire tried to explain that hope was choosing to believe in positive outcomes even when the data suggested otherwise. It was irrational, but it was also what kept humans moving forward through impossible situations. The scholar found this fascinating and somewhat disturbing in equal measure. Lauren White had traveled to the station for the vote, and she found Claire in the observation deck that looked down on Earth. The planet was beautiful from orbit, with blue oceans and white clouds and the lights of cities visible on the night side. Lauren said she was proud of what they had accomplished, but exhausted from the constant pressure of being ambassadors for their entire species. Every action was scrutinized and every mistake was magnified. Claire agreed, but pointed out that every success was also magnified. They were building something unprecedented, and that was worth the exhaustion. Sophie Miller had become a teacher at the Learning Center on New Sequoia. She sent regular messages to Claire about her students, both human and alien. The latest message talked about a young Cherokee who had overcome its species' cultural prejudice against humans to become friends with its human classmates.